windmill was already turning when they arrived, not from wind. There was no wind that morning in the Ligurian hills, just the kind of heavy pre-dawn stillness that makes sound travel wrong, that makes boots on gravel sound like they're coming from everywhere at once. The two Italian officers moved through the dark with the confidence of men who had done this before. They had a name, they had an address, they had orders that nobody had bothered to write down. What they did not have was any understanding of what Erminio Dossena had been building in that barn for 11 months. The first officer stepped through the doorway, the counterweight dropped, the arms swung, and in approximately 1.5 seconds, 2 men in Italian military uniforms were no longer a problem that anyone in that valley would have to solve. That is the version that survived in fragments. In a single partisan debrief document, in the recollections of a priest who lived 3 kilometers away and heard the impact from his bed, and in the testimony of one woman who refused to give her last name to the OSS interviewer who found her in 1947. The official Italian record of that night lists both officers as killed in action during a partisan ambush. There was no ambush. There was one man, one machine, and a decision that had been made weeks before anyone came looking. But to understand why Erminio Dossena built a killing trap inside a grain barn in the hills above Genoa, and why that story was buried under a cleaner, more comfortable lie, you have to go back to what the Italian occupation of its own people actually looked like by the winter of 1944. By late 1943, Italy existed in 2 simultaneous realities that had almost nothing to do with each other. In Rome, in the cleaned corridors of the new Badoglio government, officials were carefully constructing a narrative of Italy as the first liberated nation, a co-belligerent, a country that had woken from the fascist dream and was now suffering alongside the Allies. In the north, in Piedmont, in Liguria, in the industrial arc stretching from Turin to Trieste, a different Italy was operating on entirely different terms. The German occupation had moved in fast after the armistice of September 8th, but the Germans had brought help. Italian fascist militia, reconstituted under the Social Republic that Mussolini now led from Salo at German insistence, formed the enforcement layer of a repression that often exceeded what the Germans themselves required. This distinction matters. It matters because the 2 officers who came to Dossena's barn were not German. They were Italian. They spoke his dialect. One of them, according to the woman's testimony, had grown up in a village 12 kilometers from where he died. This was not foreign occupation in the traditional sense. This was a civil war wearing the uniform of occupation law, and the men enforcing it understood the terrain, the families, the networks, and the silences better than any German regiment could. Erminio Dossena was 43 years old in the winter of 1944. He had worked grain processing machinery for 20 years. He had 2 sons, one of whom had gone north with the Garibaldi Brigade in October. He had a barn, a broken windmill that had not generated useful power since 1941, and a mind that had been trained since boyhood to understand mechanical advantage, load distribution, and the specific physics of counterweighted arms. He was not a soldier. He had never been a soldier. The record does not show him attending any partisan cell meetings or receiving any weapons from the resistance networks operating out of Genoa. What the record does show, indirectly, through a supply manifest seized from a hardware merchant in 1945, is that someone in the Dossena area purchased specific quantities of iron rod, chain linkage, and pivot-grade steel in 3 separate transactions between January and September 1944. The merchant's post-war testimony to a local magistrate identified the buyer only as a farmer from the hills. He did not give a name. He may not have known one, or he may have understood by 1945 that some names were better left unspoken. The valley Dossena lived in had already paid a price. In March 1944, a village 4 kilometers east had been subjected to a reprisal burning after a German supply column was attacked on the road below. 6 houses, 12 people made homeless in February temperatures. No one was charged. No one was ever identified as responsible for the attack that triggered it. That ambiguity was itself a weapon. Collective punishment operated best when communities could not trace its logic, when they never knew which action would produce which consequence. You could behave perfectly and still have your house burned because someone 3 valleys over had cut a telegraph wire. The terror was architectural. It did not require consistent enforcement. It required only that enforcement remain possible at any moment. Into that architecture, Dossena introduced a variable that the architecture had not accounted for. The intelligence failure, if you want to call it that, ran in two directions simultaneously throughout the autumn of 1944, and both directions pointed toward the same catastrophe. The Italian Social Republic's security apparatus in Liguria was under pressure from above and below at the same time. From above, German commanders were pushing for demonstrable results against the partisan infrastructure that was slowing supply movements through the Apennine passes. The passes mattered enormously, more than most operational histories of the Italian campaign acknowledge. Allied pressure in the south was forcing German logistics to rely increasingly on the northern routes, and those routes were being harassed with growing sophistication. Not just cut wires and ambushed trucks, timed disruptions, coordinated interference across multiple points. Someone was organizing, and the Germans needed the Italian militia to find the organizers. From below, informants were producing names. Some of those names were genuine partisans, some were personal enemies of the informants, some were men who had simply refused to cooperate with labor requisitions or grain seizures. The security apparatus, under pressure to show results, was not in a strong position to discriminate carefully. A name that came in twice was treated as confirmed intelligence. A name that arrived from two different sources, even if both sources were neighbors who shared a grudge, constituted actionable information. Dossena's name came in twice. The documentation does not survive to tell us what the accusations were. The priest's recollection, recorded by a diocesan historian in 1962, refers only to trouble about his son and about something in the barn. Whether the informants knew what was actually in the barn, or whether they had invented a connection to partisan activity from other suspicions, is unknowable. What is known is that by November 1944, Dossena was on a list, and men who went on that list in Liguria in November 1944 did not generally receive formal charges or civilian trial. What they received was a visit. The Security and Political Investigation Office for the Ligurian Zone, operating under the formal name of the Fascist Militia's Intelligence Branch, but functioning in practice as an extrajudicial enforcement unit, processed names on that list through a procedure that was never officially codified but was entirely consistent in its application. Two officers would be assigned. They would proceed to the named location. They would conduct what the paperwork called an interview and search. The paperwork was filed before the visit took place, and the outcome column was left blank to be completed afterward. Sometimes it was completed with detained, sometimes with resisted and neutralized. The phrase carried no specific legal meaning. It required no corroboration. It functioned as a bureaucratic period at the end of a sentence that began with an informant's whispered name. The two officers assigned to Dossena were Tenente Aldo Ferrante and Brigadiere Carlo Mareu. Ferrante was 29, Mareu was 34. Both had joined the reconstituted militia following the armistice. Their service records, partially recovered from RS-1 archive fragments after the war, show no disciplinary notations and no commendations. The record of men who moved through institutional violence without distinguishing themselves in either direction. They were not ideological monsters in the documented sense. They were functionaries operating inside a system that had made their function lethal, and they had apparently never asked, or had stopped asking, what distinguished their work from simple murder. They arrived before dawn. This was standard. Pre-dawn arrival maximized disorientation, minimized the chance of neighbors intervening or warning, and compressed the window in which a target could make decisions. It was a technique refined through repetition. It had worked many times before. Dossena had been waiting for approximately 3 weeks. The woman's testimony, the one recorded in 1947 and preserved in an OSS file that was declassified in stages between 1980 and 2003, is fragmentary. She was not present. She is describing what she was told, possibly by Dossena himself, possibly by someone he told before he disappeared. The testimony is hedged in ways that suggest she understood she was still in a country where being too specific about certain events carried risk. What she describes, in compressed and careful language, is a mechanism attached to the main door of the barn's interior section. The windmill arm, already large, already counterweighted for grain processing leverage, had been modified. Additional weight had been added to one side. The pivot mechanism had been altered. A cable, routed through pulleys mounted to the upper wall, connected the arm to the door latch in a specific way. Opening the door from the inside did nothing. The door opened normally from inside, but the exterior latch, when lifted and pulled, engaged the cable, released the counterweight brake, and allowed the weighted arm to complete its arc in the interior space, a space that someone entering through that door would necessarily occupy. She does not use mechanical terms. She describes it as the thing he made from the mill and says that it came around fast. She says Dossena told her, or the person who told her, that he had tested the timing with a wooden post, that the post had been driven 18 inches into the far wall on the first test, that he had then adjusted the weight to ensure the arm stayed level through the arc rather than dropping, which would have reduced force at the point of contact. 18 inches into the far wall. The barn's interior measured roughly 6 meters across. The two officers entered, apparently together or in close sequence, at approximately 4 in the morning. The arm completed its arc. The distance to the wall was consistent with what the priest heard from 3 kilometers away. Not an explosion, he said. Something structural, like a building settling, but fast. Both men died. The priest believed it was immediate, based on the absence of any sound afterward. No voices, no movement. The silence that followed was, in his words, complete and total, like the sound had been turned off. Dossena was gone from the valley within 48 hours. He was not pursued, or if he was pursued, the pursuit was not documented in any surviving file. The 2 bodies were recovered by militia personnel who arrived the following afternoon. Based on the officers failing to report in what happened when those personnel entered the barn is not described in any record. The recovery report, if one was written, has not survived or has not been released. The official classification, killed in partisan ambush, was assigned within days. It required no investigation. It required no witnesses. It assigned the deaths to an anonymous collective enemy rather than to a single identified man with a grain barn and a reason. The reclassification was not incidental. It was, in the context of what 1944 meant for the Italian Social Republic, functionally necessary. 2 officers killed by a mechanical trap built by a single farmer in the hills carried implications that the RSY's security apparatus could not afford to process honestly. It implied that the population was not pacified. It implied that resistance was not limited to organized partisan bands with external support, the kind of enemy that could be framed as foreign-backed, politically extreme, separable from ordinary Italian civilians. A 43-year-old grain farmer who built a killing machine from his own windmill was none of those things. He was indistinguishable in his daily life from hundreds of thousands of other northern Italian civilians. He had no special training. He had received no weapons. He had not been radicalized by a political ideology. He had simply been given enough reason and enough time and enough mechanical knowledge. If that story circulated, if it became the kind of story that gets told in farmhouses and churches and at the edges of markets, it changed what other farmers in other hills might begin to think about their own barns and their own machinery and the specific weights and pivots of the tools they had been using all their lives. The ambush classification buried that possibility. It transformed the event from an act of individual civilian resistance into a combat incident between organized military forces. It removed Dossena from the narrative entirely. It protected the apparatus from a truth that was more threatening than any partisan brigade, that ordinary people, cornered sufficiently, become dangerous in ways that no intelligence apparatus can fully anticipate or prevent. The Allied investigation in 1947, the interview that produced the woman's fragmented testimony, appears to have been part of a broader effort to document RSY atrocities for potential war crimes proceedings. The Dossena file was not used in any prosecution. The investigator's summary note, visible on the file's cover sheet, reads, "Incident outcome favorable to civilian. No further action recommended." That phrase, favorable to civilian, is doing significant work. It is accurate. It is also a way of closing a door. What happened to Dossena himself is not documented in any recovered file. He may have reached the partisan formations in the hills. He may have crossed into Switzerland. He may have simply walked far enough from that valley that no one who mattered ever found him. The woman who gave testimony did not know or would not say. The priest, when interviewed for the Diocesan History in 1962, said only that he had heard Dossena survive the war and went somewhere in the north. He offered no more specific information and was apparently not pressed for any. There is a version of this story in which Erminio Dossena is a hero, and the two men he killed are simply agents of a murderous regime, their deaths appropriate, their fates sealed by the choices they made when they chose to serve that regime. That version is emotionally satisfying and probably morally defensible, and almost completely useless as a way of understanding what actually happened in northern Italy between 1943 and 1945. The more difficult version requires sitting with the fact that Ferrante and Moreo were Italian men in an Italian civil war, that the lines of moral clarity that look sharp from 80 years of distance were genuinely obscured for people living inside the event, and that the system which put them on that road to that barn was the same system that had been constructed piece by piece over 20 years of fascist governance, with the participation, enthusiastic, resigned, or simply unremarkable, of millions of ordinary Italian citizens. Dossena did not build his trap because he was a partisan. He was never confirmed as a partisan. He built it because men with authority and weapons and a list of names were coming to his door, and he had no access to the official mechanisms of justice or protection. And he knew how to calculate load-bearing tolerances and the physics of a counterweighted arm. He used what he had. He solved the problem in front of him using the only tools available. The state that was coming to kill him had the machinery of law, the paperwork of legitimacy, and the infrastructure of an organized modern government. He had an old windmill and 11 months.
He won!
The fact that his victory was immediately reclassified, officially erased, and buried under a more comfortable label is not a footnote. It is the point. The system that could not protect him also could not acknowledge that he had defeated it. To acknowledge it would have been to admit what kind of system it was, one that forced a 43-year-old grain farmer to become an engineer of death in his own barn, simply to survive the visit of two men with a blank form and a name on a list. The windmill turned that morning without wind. That is the image the priest remembered. He woke to the sound of impact, looked toward the hills, and in the last gray dark before dawn, he could see the barn's mill arm completing its rotation, moving in silence through the cold air as though nothing particular had happened, as though it were simply doing what mills do. Which, in a way, it was.